Right now, as you are watching this video, over 150 oil supertankers are sitting completely still in the waters off Oman and the Persian Gulf. Engines off, anchors down, going nowhere. Each one of those ships carries up to 2 million barrels of crude oil, enough to fuel an entire country for a day. And not a single one of them is moving, because Iran, in response to the devastating US and Israeli military strikes of February 28th, has shut the door on 20% of the entire world's oil supply. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that literally powers the global economy, is closed, and the world is bleeding. To understand why the entire world is in economic panic right now, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, and why nothing else like it exists anywhere on this planet. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow strip of water, just 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, sitting between the coast of Iran to the north and the coast of Oman to the south. It is the only maritime exit route from the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world's oceans. There is no alternative, no other way out, no bypass, no detour. Every drop of oil that comes out of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE has to pass through this single choke point to reach the rest of the world. Under normal conditions, before this war began, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil passed through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Let that number sink in. 20 million barrels every single day. That represents roughly 20% of all the oil consumed anywhere on Earth, every day, without fail, for decades. But oil is not the only thing flowing through these waters. 20% of all global liquefied natural gas, including Qatar's massive LNG exports that power homes and factories across Europe and Asia. 30% of Europe's entire jet fuel supply originates from or transits through this strait. 1/3 of all global fertilizer trade passes through these waters. Aluminum from the UAE, petrochemicals, steel, pharmaceuticals, industrial chemicals, plastics, rubber, electronics components, batteries. All of it flowing through one single narrow corridor. China receives 1/3 of all its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Japan gets 70% of its Middle Eastern oil through this strait. South Korea, India, Taiwan, all deeply dependent. 84% of all crude oil shipments through the strait in 2024 went to Asian markets, 84%. And on March 2nd, 2026, a senior commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stood before cameras and said 6 words that sent shockwaves through every economy on the planet. He said, "The strait is closed. Any vessel that passes will be set ablaze." Not a warning, a declaration, and Iran has been true to its word. As of March 12, 2026, Iran had confirmed 21 separate attacks on merchant ships attempting to navigate these waters. The US-flagged Stena Imperative was struck twice at the port of Bahrain, causing a fire that killed a port worker. A Thai bulk carrier called the Mayuri Nari was struck and set ablaze near the strait's entrance. Tanker traffic did not collapse gradually, it collapsed instantly. Before February 28th, over 100 ships transited Hormuz every single day. On the night of March 2nd, not a single tanker in the strait broadcast an automatic identification signal. 0 ships, 0 signals, 0 movement. 150 supertankers anchored themselves in the waters off Oman, just outside the range of Iranian weapons, waiting, going nowhere. And the world's largest shipping companies, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, and CMA CGM, suspended all Middle East routes simultaneously. What happened to oil prices in the days after the Strait of Hormuz closed tells you everything you need to know about how serious this crisis is. Before February 28th, before the US and Israeli strikes on Iran, Brent crude oil was trading at around $70 per barrel. Within 24 hours of the strikes, it crossed $80. Within 3 days, it crossed $90. By March 8th, it crossed $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years. It surged to $126 per barrel at its peak. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz alone added roughly $40 per barrel as a pure geopolitical risk premium, above and beyond what market fundamentals would normally dictate. And the warnings coming from the world's top economic institutions are getting darker by the day. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas calculated that removing 20% of global oil supply from the market, which is exactly what the Hormuz closure does, will reduce global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in the second quarter of 2026 alone. Goldman Sachs immediately raised their 2026 U.S. inflation forecast by 0.8 percentage points to 2.9%. They trimmed their GDP growth forecast by 0.3%, and quietly, very quietly, raised their odds of a U.S. recession by 5 percentage points to 25%. Oxford Economics went further still. They modeled a scenario where oil averages $140 per barrel for 2 months. Their conclusion? The Eurozone enters recession. The United Kingdom enters recession. Japan enters recession. The United States grinds to an economic standstill. And then came the direct threat from Iran itself. The IRGC spokesperson looked directly into the camera and said, "Not 1 liter of oil will pass through the Strait of Hormuz. You will not be able to artificially lower the price of oil. Expect oil at $200 per barrel." $200 per barrel. Analysts at Wood Mackenzie say $150 is coming. They describe $200 as, quote, "not outside the realms of possibility." Now let us talk about what this costs the shipping industry directly, because these numbers are extraordinary. Shipping companies willing to attempt the crossing before insurers pulled their coverage were paying supertanker charter rates of $423,736 per day. That is a 94% jump overnight. And then came the decisive moment. On March 5th, war risk insurance coverage for all ships operating in the Persian Gulf was effectively withdrawn by global insurance markets. No insurance, no passage. Not because ship captains were afraid, because the legal and financial risk of an uninsured $150 million supertanker being destroyed by an Iranian drone was simply impossible to absorb. The economics of passage became impossible, and the Strait of Hormuz fell silent. You might be watching this and thinking, this is a problem for oil companies, for governments, for the Middle East, not for me. I need you to stop right there, because what is happening in that 34-kilometer strip of water is already inside your home, right now, today. Let us start with what you feel immediately. Gas prices across the United States have already risen by more than 50 cents per gallon on average since the Hormuz closure began. California, which is always the bellwether for U.S. fuel costs, is already averaging above $5 per gallon. And that number is still climbing as this documentary is being made. But gas at the pump is just the most visible number, the one that stings first. The real damage runs far deeper. Let us talk about your food. 1/3 of all global fertilizer trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. This includes enormous volumes of nitrogen fertilizer, the kind American farmers absolutely need to grow corn and soybeans. Since the closure began, urea prices at the New Orleans fertilizer hub have jumped from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton. That is a 43% price increase in weeks. And here is the catastrophic timing. This is happening right at the start of the spring planting season in the Midwest. The exact moment when American farmers most desperately need affordable fertilizer to plant their crops. Supply chain expert Daryl Fletcher of Bannockburn Global Forex put it plainly. He said, and I quote, "Not great timing for the planting window in the Midwest for soy and corn." That is an understatement of historic proportions. Higher fertilizer costs mean higher food costs, not in 6 months, in weeks. Grocery prices for bread, meat, cooking oil, and almost every processed food product are all coming under simultaneous pressure. Now let us talk about your clothes. The Asian garment industry depends on petrochemical inputs shipped through Hormuz to produce the synthetic fabrics in most of the clothing you wear every day. Polyester, nylon, acrylic, all petrochemical derivatives, all supply chains disrupted. Your clothing costs are next, now your car. Aluminum from the UAE and Gulf states moves through the strait. Electronic components and batteries for electric vehicles. Rubber, industrial chemicals. Every single component of your vehicle has a supply chain that runs through this waterway. Now your medicine. This is the one that gets almost no coverage, but it may be the most urgent of all. The United States receives a significant portion of its generic drug prescriptions from pharmaceutical supply chains that run through or depend on production in the Strait of Hormuz region. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, the core chemical compounds in generic drugs, are manufactured largely in India. India sources 60% of its oil from the Middle East, through Hormuz. A prolonged energy crisis in India disrupts pharmaceutical production, which disrupts the supply of generic drugs to American pharmacies. And logistics expert Craig Geske from the supply chain firm Trafix warned, the initial ocean freight impact may take 10 to 14 days to appear. But the real pressure typically hits within 2 to 5 weeks. Ports across the United States will begin experiencing severe congestion, delivery delays across virtually every product category you can name. The Strait of Hormuz is not on the other side of the world. It is in your grocery cart, it is at your gas pump, it is in your medicine cabinet, it is in your wardrobe. The closure is already inside your home. Now let us zoom out and examine which countries are suffering most from this crisis, because the pain is not distributed equally, and the numbers are deeply alarming. 84% of all crude oil and condensate shipped through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024 was destined for Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea combined account for 69% of all crude oil flows through the strait. Their factories, their power grids, their transport systems, their entire economies, all built on the assumption that Hormuz stays open. Let us go country by country. Japan. The Middle East supplies 75% of Japan's oil, and 70% of that Middle Eastern oil reaches Japan through the Strait of Hormuz. Japan holds emergency reserves covering approximately 254 days of consumption, the most prepared nation in Asia by far. But even Japan's buffer cannot absorb a closure that lasts more than one full quarter of the year. Japanese manufacturing began slowing in the second week of March 2026. Emergency cabinet meetings were convened. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry announced a release from private and national reserves. South Korea. South Korea's net oil imports represent 2.7% of its entire gross domestic product, one of the highest ratios in Asia. Nomura Bank flagged South Korea as among the most vulnerable economies globally on the current account front. South Korea holds LNG reserves covering only approximately 2 to 4 weeks of stable demand. After that, serious problems begin. India. India faces what economists are calling a dual physical and financial shock. More than 60% of India's oil imports come from the Middle East, all through Hormuz, and more than half of India's LNG imports are Gulf-linked. A Hormuz-driven crude spike simultaneously lifts India's oil import costs and its LNG contract prices at the same time. India's refinery reserves cover only approximately 20 to 25 days, making it among the most exposed major economies in the world. China. China holds approximately 900 million barrels in strategic reserves, equivalent to just under 3 months of imports. It is more flexible than Japan, South Korea, and India. But if the closure persists beyond 3 months, China would need to compete aggressively for Atlantic oil cargoes, which would tighten the entire Pacific basin and intensify price competition across all of Asia. Pakistan. Pakistan has limited storage and virtually no procurement flexibility. On March 4th, Pakistan officially requested Saudi Arabia to reroute oil supplies through the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Saudi Arabia arranged at least one alternative crude shipment, but this is a trickle. Pakistan's energy crisis is worsening week by week. Iraq. This may be the most dramatic story of all. On March 3rd, Iraq was forced to begin shutting down operations at the Rumaila oil field, one of the largest oil fields on the entire planet. Not because of military attacks, not because of sabotage, not because of equipment failure, but because Iraq ran out of storage space. With 150 tankers unable to leave the strait, Iraqi oil had nowhere to go. The tanks filled completely, the pipelines backed up, and Iraq had to shut the wells themselves. Kuwait followed suit shortly after. Qatar's energy minister Saad Sherida Al-Kabi issued a warning that stopped the world. He said, and I quote him directly, "If the war continues, Gulf energy producers may be forced to halt exports entirely and declare force majeure." And then he said these words, "This will bring down economies of the world." Read that again. Not hurt economies, not damage economies, bring down economies. The energy minister of one of the world's largest LNG exporters is warning of global economic collapse, and that warning was issued on March 6, 2026. The international response to the Hormuz crisis has been unprecedented in scale, and deeply revealing of how serious this situation has truly become. On March 11th, the International Energy Agency announced the largest coordinated emergency oil reserve release in its entire history. 400 million barrels of oil released simultaneously from member nations' strategic stockpiles. It sounds enormous. It is not enough. The world consumes 105 million barrels of oil every single day. That 400 million barrel emergency release covers just 4 days of global consumption. 4 days. Even measured only against the Strait of Hormuz's normal daily flow of 20 million barrels, the release equals just 20 days of typical flows. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve held 415 million barrels as of February 18th. Its maximum drawdown capacity is 4.4 million barrels per day. And oil requires 13 full days to reach U.S. markets after a presidential release order. It cannot flood the market overnight. It cannot replace the strait. Not even close. So what are the real alternative solutions? Option 1. Saudi pipeline bypass. The IEA estimates that only 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day can be redirected through Saudi and Emirati overland pipelines, primarily the Saudi East-West pipeline running to the Yanbu port on the Red Sea. The normal Hormuz flow is 20 million barrels per day. That means even using all available pipeline capacity, the daily net shortfall remains 14.5 to 16.5 million barrels per day. Pakistan and other nations are already requesting access to the Yanbu route, but it cannot begin to replace Hormuz. Option 2. U.S. naval escorts. Trump publicly encouraged ships to keep sailing. He said, quote, "I think they should. You're going to see great safety very quickly." Military and shipping experts point out that Iran has layered defenses, sea mines, anti-ship ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and fast attack boats that make even escorted convoy operations extremely high risk. 3 ships were struck by projectiles on March 11th alone, including one attack just 18 nautical miles north of Oman, while Trump was making his encouraging statements. Option 3. Cape of Good Hope rerouting. Some shipping companies have begun rerouting vessels around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. This adds 10,000 to 14,000 kilometers to every single voyage. That is 10 to 14 extra days of sailing time, massively increased fuel costs, fewer total voyages per year. Severe congestion at alternative terminals worldwide. It is not a solution. It is a slow-motion delay of the same crisis. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas has modeled 3 distinct scenarios for how this crisis ends, and the outcomes range from painful to potentially catastrophic. Scenario 1. Short closure. The strait reopens in the third quarter of 2026. Just 1/4 of full closure. In this scenario, the Dallas Fed projects oil prices averaging $98 per barrel for the second quarter. Global real GDP growth falls by 2.9 percentage points in Q2 alone. But recovery begins in Q3 as shipping resumes. Full-year growth falls by just 0.2 percentage points. Painful, but survivable. Scenario 2. Prolonged closure. The strait remains closed for 2 full quarters, 6 months of near-zero normal tanker traffic. Oil prices rise further, potentially to $132 per barrel by year-end. The impact on growth remains negative through all of 2026. Full-year GDP falls by 0.3 percentage points. Multiple Asian economies enter recession. Europe faces severe energy shortages heading into the winter months. Scenario 3. Extended crisis. The strait remains closed for 3 full quarters, 9 months. Global GDP annual growth collapses by 1.3 percentage points. Oil potentially exceeds $140 per barrel, the level Oxford Economics calls the breaking point for the global economy. At $140 sustained, the Eurozone enters recession. The United Kingdom enters recession. Japan enters recession. The United States economy grinds to a standstill. Inflation spirals beyond central bank control. And one expert, the founder of Rapidan Energy, had already assigned a 75% probability to this conflict erupting weeks before it actually happened. He described the Hormuz closure as, and I quote, "a very serious development for the world's oil and gas markets given their complete dependence on Hormuz production." The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway, it is the economic clock of war. A short closure is an oil shock. A medium closure is a global recession trigger. A long closure is a catastrophe from which recovery takes years. And right now, there is no end in sight. The Strait of Hormuz crisis is the most significant economic disruption since the 1970s oil embargo. It is evolving every single day. And at Fault Lines, we track every